Well, it looks like the decision is final. Following the resignation of Ukraine's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Alexander Syrskyi, is also stepping down. This is exactly the information that insiders have shared, and it's exactly what we discussed with you 2 days ago on this YouTube channel. For the fifth day, mass protests continue in Ukrainian cities. They started as rallies in support of the dismissed Minister of Defense, Mikhail Fedorov, but turned into a demand to remove the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrskyi. People are coming out in Kyiv, Lviv, Kharkiv, Dnipro and other cities with one slogan, Syrskyi out. And today, July 20th, everything came to a head. Zelensky has been meeting with combat commanders for the fifth day in a row. The names of candidates to replace Syrskyi have leaked to the media, and for tonight, a Supreme Command meeting has been scheduled. That is, the very meeting where such decisions are made and where the new Commander-in-Chief may be announced. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine naturally denies everything, but let's be honest, what else can they say just a few hours before the meeting? In this episode, I will break everything down by names and dates. Who is actually being considered to replace Alexander Syrskyi? Who is the favorite? Will Mikhailo Fedorov return? And what position he is willing to accept? And what does this series of meetings between the president and the generals mean? After all, the official version sounded simple. The president listened to reports from the commanders about the situation at the front and about what the combat units need. But it turned out that Zelensky has already met with the three key candidates several times, and it's clear that they're talking not only about the situation at the front. My name is Alexei Pechi, let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, please subscribe to this YouTube channel. We are moving towards the mark of 300,000 subscribers, and I would be grateful for your subscription. So let me start this episode with the official position, to immediately separate it from reality because the reaction turned out to be quite telling. Today, July 20th, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine issued a denial. Reports that Syrskyi is being dismissed are not true. They said that Alexander Syrskyi continues to perform his duties, and Chief of the General Staff Andriy Ignatov does as well. The General Staff simply reminded everyone of that formality. Dismissal from these positions occurs only on the basis of a presidential decree. Therefore, since no one has seen such a decree from Zelensky, both remain in their positions. But this brevity is very telling, as are the rumors that the top military leadership tried to persecute and reprimand servicemen who took part in protests across the country. But in one phrase from the General Staff's statement lies the essence of the matter. The General Staff, as you noticed, doesn't say that Syrskyi will stay or that all the rumors are lies. The General Staff writes that there is no presidential decree, so Syrskyi and Hanatov remain in their positions for now. Well, according to the Ukrainian legislative procedure, the decree is signed based on the results of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's meeting, which is scheduled for this evening. So, the denial is based purely on what is technically true. At the time of the statement, the document really didn't exist, but that doesn't guarantee it won't appear this evening or tomorrow morning. Presidential advisor Dmytro Litvin, responding to journalists, added a bit of confusion. And he stated that new appointments are unlikely to happen this evening. That is, most likely not this evening either. This is a very vague wording, but it's vague just enough to leave room for maneuvering in both directions. But my sources among the deputies and some Western journalists say that right now, inside the president's office, the discussion is not about whether to remove Syrskyi or not, but about who will replace him. Let me briefly remind you of the background, because what's happening today is actually due to public protest. On July 15, Zelensky dismissed Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov, formalizing it by having the entire cabinet of ministers resign at once. Prime Minister Sviridenko's government resigned, and Fedorov simply wasn't included in the new cabinet. The reason the president gave at a closed meeting with the Servant of the People faction was an irreconcilable conflict between Fedorov and Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi. Later, Fedorov himself confirmed this openly. And Zelensky added that without his personal presence, the two of them couldn't even have a calm conversation. At the briefing after his dismissal, Fedorov gave his version of what happened, and according to him, it was Syrskyi who gave the president an ultimatum, either the commander-in-chief or the minister. Fedorov proposed replacing both Syrskyi and Chief of the General Staff Gnatov, but the president disagreed and instead chose the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine. At that time, Fedorov also mentioned a telling detail. He said that the commander of the joint forces, Mikhail Dropaty, received 3 reprimands from Syrskyi right away, despite his successes at the front. So remember this last name Dropaty. He's now on the list of candidates, and Mikhailo Fedorov mentioned him for a reason. After Fedorov's briefing, people basically took to the streets. But to be objective, they went out at the same time, along with the briefing, but this briefing really fueled the protest itself. At first, people came out in support of Fedorov, but then, after figuring out who was involved in the conflict, they started protesting against Syrskyi. And this escalation of the street protest into an open campaign against Syrskyi became the factor that most likely made Zelensky consider changing the commander-in-chief. In other words, the street overruled his decision from a week ago. Syrskyi, by the way, has long been called by the harsh nickname the Butcher in Ukrainian and Western media for his commitment to holding positions at any cost, which critics associate with high personnel losses. So the accumulated frustration in the army existed even before the rallies. Well, the story with the Syrskyi Assault Regiment, where more than 20 non-combat deaths of recruits are now being investigated, made things even worse. It definitely added fuel to the fire. But while the streets were loudly protesting, no less loud discussions and negotiations were taking place in the office of the president. And this actually revealed President Zelensky's intentions better than any statements. Because publicly, you won't hear about Syrskyi's resignation until the final decree is signed. Zelensky personally met with combat commanders for several days in a row, and at first Zelensky presented it like this, as if he was meeting with the commanders to hear from them. The situation at the front and what different units of the armed forces of Ukraine need in terms of weapons, supplies, and so on. Just to get a handle on the situation. On the one hand, that's true, but on the other hand, it was just a cover. That is, it's obvious that, of course, Zelensky was getting reports about the situation at the front, but that wasn't the main reason for all these interviews, like I said in my previous episode. And I talked about this topic back on July 18th, that Zelensky's meetings with the commanders were actually vetting a new candidate for the position of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And here's a fact for you. Zelensky has been meeting with certain commanders for the second day in a row. As for the others, he listened to them once and let them go. That's it. Let's go through the names of the people he brought in, because this is exactly the list for the interview for the position of the new commander-in-chief. Mikhail Dropaty, Major General, Commander of the Joint Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. President Zelensky has been talking to him for 2 days in a row now and probably spends the most time with him. Dropaty reported on the situation in the most difficult sectors of the front, in Sumy, Kharkiv, Luhansk and Donetsk regions. His biography. The biography is very telling. Since November 2024, he has been commanding the ground forces. In January 2025, he headed the operational strategic group Khortytsia. Well, on June 1, 2025, he submitted his resignation from the post of Commander of the Ground Forces. After the night strike on the training ground in the Sumy region, where unfortunately service members at the training unit were killed. So, this is a person who took responsibility for the tragedy and resigned, which in the Ukrainian military environment is still considered a sign of decency. Next is Volodymyr Horbatyuk, Brigadier General, Deputy Chief of the General Staff for Operations. Zelensky also held talks with him for 2 days in a row. In 2015, Horbatyuk commanded the 54th Separate Mechanized Brigade, and he was the first deputy commander of the Southern Operational Command. The next candidate is Ole Apostol. He is the commander of the Air Assault Forces. He was also among those the president heard out more than once. And another candidate is Andriy Beletsky, commander of the 3rd Army Corps and founder of Azov. According to insiders, Zelensky also gave him special treatment, and talked with him for a long time. After all these meetings, the president himself wrote very simply and briefly that he listened to reports on the situation at the front and that, and here I quote, "Tomorrow there will be key talks." This was yesterday evening. Well, the key talks are actually a meeting of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's staff. Well, I think at this point, you're already eager to find out who might take Alexander Syrskyi's place. So there is different information coming in, but it all comes down to a few names. According to Liga.net, citing sources in the president's office and the government, initially as many as 11 candidates are being considered. I would add that sources in the Verkhovna Rada also confirmed that there were indeed more than 10 candidates initially. Although there is no final confirmation at the moment as to who exactly will replace Syrskyi, and his name will be kept secret until the last moment. The reason is obvious. After all, it's war, and you can't leave the army without command even for a second. But out of the 11 candidates, probably the main 4 favorites have stood out. In first place is that very same Oleg Apostol, the commander of the airborne assault troops. According to unconfirmed rumors, I'll put it that way for now, according to unconfirmed rumors, he has the best chances. And so, sources name him as the likely favorite to replace Syrskyi, but here, if I may say so, there's a little problem. If Apostol replaces Syrskyi, it will just be a formal reshuffling of positions. Why? The thing is, the commander of the air assault forces, Ole Apostol, actually supported Alexander Syrskyi. He responded to the protests and said that he knows well the cost of combat orders and the responsibility for the lives of soldiers. According to him, the military command system is based on discipline, unity of command, and the personal responsibility of commanders. He also criticized categorical judgments about the military leadership from people, quote, who have no combat experience, hinting at Mikhail Fedorov, and emphasized that substantive criticism is acceptable.
И подчеркнул, что предметная критика.
However, unfounded accusations and public insults only undermine trust in the army. In addition, Apostol urged servicemen not to get involved in political disputes under any circumstances and not to participate in these protests. And he emphasized that the armed forces have been and remain outside of politics. The next candidate is Mikhail Dropaty. He is the commander of the joint forces, the very one the president spoke with 2 days later. And about whom Mikhail Fedorov told the story with those 3 reprimands from Syrskyi. One of the main contenders, according to Liga.net, that's a completely different story, and I would say he's a representative from the opposite camp. Let's move on. Andrei Beletsky, commander of the 3rd Army Corps and founder of Azov. A popular figure, no doubt, but I must note, politically a difficult figure. Because he has a background that complicates, or could hypothetically complicate, relations with Western partners. Let me explain what I mean. The same Poles can constantly, in a populist way, remind everyone that Andrei Beletsky is connected with Azov, with terrible nationalists, and so on and so forth. So right now is the period when the Poles will definitely focus on this and try to score political points for themselves. That's why this could become a problem on the foreign policy front. That's why, personally and subjectively, I don't really believe that Andrei Beletsky will be appointed as the commander, but that's just my subjective opinion, nothing more. Next, Igor Abolensky. He is a colonel, the commander of the National Guard Corps Kartia. He represents that very new generation of commanders who are focusing on technology and drones. Exactly the philosophy that Mikhail Fedorov promoted, and Fedorov himself also praised him. And also, as I already mentioned, Gorbatyuk appears on the lists. So, the core of the candidates are commanders of corps and operational groups from the new wave. And not some old guard of generals. That's important to note. But it's still important to keep in mind, the name of the new commander-in-chief hasn't been officially announced. The selection is underway now, and according to rumors, the favorite is Apostol. But for now, these are just rumors. It's not a completely finished, resolved matter, no. I should specifically warn that right now Russian propaganda is already starting to push its own narratives. Well, for example, that the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine will supposedly be the head of intelligence, the former head of intelligence, Kirilo Budanov. This is being reported with reference to sources in Russian media. In other words, it's a Kremlin fabrication, and you can't trust it. You can't. Budanov isn't on any lists at all for now. A separate topic in all of this is the fate of Mikhailo Fedorov himself, and here some fresh specifics have emerged. According to sources, Fedorov has indicated that he is ready to return to government. He is ready to return to Zelensky's team, but only for one specific position, back as Ukraine's Minister of Defense. Not as an advisor, not as a deputy, not in any other capacity. There's no need to create a separate department just for me. No, exactly. To his former post as Ukraine's Minister of Defense. He has already declined the previously offered position of advisor. So here's the situation. The protesting crowd is demanding that Fedorov be reinstated as minister and that Syrskyi be removed. Fedorov agrees to return only as Minister of Defense, and the position of Minister of Defense was formally intended for the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, Klimenko. So we have acting officials, but formally it was still intended for Klimenko. And it turns into a dilemma. Well, either Zelensky completely changes course under protest pressure and brings back Mikhail Fedorov while simultaneously dismissing Syrskyi. Then the protesters get exactly what they demanded, or Zelensky appoints Klimenko and keeps Syrskyi. And then the conflict with the public continues. So basically the protest achieves nothing at all, or after all Zelensky finds some kind of middle ground, so to speak. And in fact, both Fedorov and Syrskyi both leave, and new people will take their places, a new commander-in-chief and a new minister. So, it's a complete renewal. And then the protesters will only be partially satisfied halfway. But in the end, this will quell the protest. Because, okay, Fedorov wasn't brought back, but Syrskyi was also dismissed. There's also a procedural hitch here, because to appoint the Minister of Defense again, a vote by the Verkhovna Rada is required. And according to lawmakers, the Verkhovna Rada will only convene on August 18. So even if a decision on Fedorov is made, it won't be possible to formalize it quickly. Well, Ukraine could be left without an approved Minister of Defense for almost a month. To be continued. And another significant signal came today from the head of the president's office, Kirilo Budanov. He responded directly for the first time to the protests taking place in many cities across Ukraine. Here is his quote. The situation surrounding the recent internal changes has caused strong emotions. I understand the people who are voicing their views. Caring is the force that has kept our state going all these years. The public's position has been heard. Well, and some are already suggesting that this was a hint from Kirilo Budanov that the rallies worked and the authorities are ready to adjust their decisions. Although perhaps this was the plan from the very beginning. Budanov added that the situation is being resolved, quote, professionally, constructively, and for the benefit of the state. And he called for everyone to remain calm, and I quote verbatim, not to hate anyone, reminding that, quote, the enemy is closely watching every one of our internal disputes and is waiting for us to start fighting among ourselves. For my part, I think this is laying the groundwork for a decision, and it will still take into account the protesters. The bottom line, 5 days of protest demanding that Syrskyi be removed, and it looks like this protest isn't going to stop anytime soon. Zelensky has been personally interviewing combat generals and combat commanders for several days in a row. A list of 11 candidates for the position of commander-in-chief has leaked to the media, and the likely favorite at the moment is the paratrooper Apostol. And besides him, another main contender is Dropatoy. Fedorov is ready to return, but only as Minister of Defense. Head of the President's office, Budanov states that the public's position has been heard, hinting that certain personnel decisions will be made. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine denies Syrskyi's resignation only because the decree hasn't been issued yet. It's signed after the Supreme Commander-in-Chief's meeting concludes. And this meeting, according to preliminary information, is scheduled for this evening. Presidential advisor Litvin cautiously says that there may not be any appointments today. He says most likely there won't be any. That is, Zelensky is still leaving himself the option to buy some time. But this whole setup, the meetings with the generals, the leaked lists of candidates, the statements by Kirilo Budanov, all of it is structured in such a way that the change of the commander-in-chief no longer looks like a question of if, but rather a question of when and who. If the decree appears tonight, Ukraine will get a new commander-in-chief for the first time since February 2024 when Zelensky was replaced. And the name of this person will determine how the army will fight throughout the next year, which I think will be the most difficult one. But it could also happen that there won't be any new commander-in-chief today. But that doesn't mean that this decision isn't taking shape in the president's office. I'll leave it at that for now, and I want to emphasize that these are all just rumors. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Please click the bell and give this episode a like. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link is in the description of this video. If you want to support the work of this channel, you can do so by making a donation using the links and payment details in the video description. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.